Hello bookworms! Today I'm going to be doing a very long requested video by all of you, and that is all about the Star Wars books and how to go about reading Star Wars books in canon, what kind of order you should follow while you're trying to read them. All those kinds of questions will be answered. So just to start, I am definitely not at all an expert, but I have learned quite a bit on my own journey of trying to read all of the canon Star Wars books, so I feel like I have a pretty good handle on it. I apologize if there's something that I say that's out of order. Again, not the Star Wars expert, but this is all of the stuff that I have learned in my experience. So to start off, for those who don't know, there are two expanded universes within the Star Wars franchise. First of all, I mean, everybody obviously is familiar with the Star Wars films. Then we have the Star Wars television shows, which are probably like the second most watched of anything. Then we've got the video games, and then we've got the books and comics. When Disney purchased Star Wars, essentially, they decided that everything that was written prior to their acquisition is no longer considered canon within the Star Wars universe. So a lot of the older Star Wars books, they're now called the Legend series. The way that I understand it is those are still stories that were told, and obviously not all stories are true. There are a lot of things that can happen over word of mouth. So those are all like legends about the Star Wars characters that we know and love. And since Disney took over, they have deemed what is canon within the universe. For people like me who never delved into the expanded universe before that takeover, it was really helpful because I now had a starting point and I now had a manageable number of books that I needed to read in order to keep up with everything, as opposed to the millions that you can find in the Legends universe. Although I do know that there were a lot of Legends fans that were really upset that those stories were no longer canon, and rightly so, because they fell in love with those quite a long time ago. But fortunately, some of the elements and some of the characters and some of the storylines from the Legend series have been making appearances in the new canon material. My secret for how I learn what I should read in what order is I use StarWarsCanonTimeline.com. That lists out every single Star Wars property that is currently in canon, and it gives you a timeline of when those stories take place. You can actually even sort to, like, if you only want to know the books, or you only want to know the movies, or you only want to know the TV shows, like you can filter. I reference that website every time a new book is announced because it's added pretty quickly, book or film or a television show. Anytime there's a new Star Wars announcement, I check out that website and figure out where in the canon timeline that is going to take place. And what I have done is I have created a Google Doc for myself. Actually, I've created two Google Docs, the first of which shows everything listed out in Star Wars canonical order. And I actually kind of did that twice. So the first version of my list is every single book, every single film, and every single television series within the Star Wars universe in canon order. With the exception, I don't include the middle grade books and I don't include the video games in my list because chances are I'm not going to play the video games and I'm probably not going to get to any of the middle grade books at this point. I may be interested in them in the future, but right now I'm focusing on the young adult and adult books because that in itself is already kind of an undertaking. I have that all listed out, and then right below it, I have everything listed out again, including the middle grade books and including the video games, just so I have that list should I ever decide that I want to tackle those properties. So once I read or watch something, I make it bold on my list, and I really like the way that Google Doc has like the setup that if I add something into it, the numbers will automatically reformat, because I did initially have this list in an email, but I had to renumber everything myself every time that something new was announced, which was so frustrating. So that's why I made myself this list. I am debating putting a copy online for you guys to potentially save your own copy of, should you want to also try to get to everything in Star Wars canon. And if I do, there will be a link to that down below. My second Google Doc that I use for Star Wars canon, because I'm a crazy person and I need two of these apparently, I made a Google Sheet of everything in canon and I have a tab for each of the properties. So my first tab is the films, because the films are the core of the Star Wars canon universe. Then I have the television shows, then I have adult books, then I have young adult books, then I have the comics, then I have middle grade books, and then finally I have the video games. So each tab has that one specific property, and then within that property shows everything in canon order. So like while my main list has all the things in canon order, my Google Sheet has the films in canon order, the books in canon order, the comics in canon order. So that way I can also see how my progress is going between the different mediums. This probably seems very intense, and that's because I am an intense person when it comes to Star Wars, apparently. One of the important things too to note is that Lucasfilm has made it clear that anything that happens in the films is the undisputed canon. So if anything ever happens in one of the books or one of the video games that ever so slightly contradicts something that happened in a film, the film is canon. This other thing that you read or played or whatever is canon, but the film takes precedence. I hope that makes sense. And the last thing that I will say before I get into showing you some of the books in the current canon is that while it is great to try to read or watch everything in a particular order to follow the story like to the fullest extent, it's impossible to do so. There is no way that you will be able to read everything in canon order solely because they are constantly announcing new books, and when things are announced, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to take place at a later time in the timeline. But that's why it's also really important for me anyway to have that main Google Doc that shows you where everything fits, because before I go into a Star Wars novel, I reference that list and I'll be able to tell myself. I usually use the films as a basis. Those are the most widely known and the freshest in my mind. So for instance, like the newest books that came out in this past month are Queen Shadow by E.K. Johnston, which is a book all about Padme and her handmaidens, and I loved it. And then there's also Master and Apprentice, which is all about Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan. And those two books, which were just published now in 2019, are some of the earliest books in Star Wars canon. So that's why I say that it's impossible to read everything in order, because you can start with those early books, but there's a good chance that in like a year or two from now, Lucasfilm will be like, surprise, new book. It's the first Star Wars book in canon. And then you're not going to just start over from the beginning. You just have to be cognizant of where in the timeline the story takes place. So for instance, when I was going to pick up Queen Shadow, I referenced my list and I was like, okay, so Queen Shadow takes place after Attack of the Clones, but prior to the Clone Wars television series, which totally makes sense if you read it. So as far as the films go, I have seen every Star Wars film that is in canon, which is all of them. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own personal progress within the Star Wars canon universe and some of my favorite properties that I have read or watched since I was a kid and getting involved in this. So the first category are the films, and I have obviously seen all of the Star Wars films that are in canon. As far as films go, my favorites will always be the original trilogy. I think that those ones just hold such a special place in my heart because I have such a long history with them and such a connection with them. And then I also really love Rogue One. I think that is the best of the newest films that has been released. Next we have television series. So I have watched all of the Clone Wars with the exception of Clone Wars Season 6, which was recently announced last year at San Diego Comic-Con. The 6th season will be premiering at some point. I don't know if they have announced it yet, but Star Wars Celebration is happening very soon. I would imagine they're going to be announcing the release date at that point. Then we've got Star Wars Rebels, which in my opinion is the superior television series. I think that there was a very clear vision of what Dave Filoni wanted to happen in that series, and it was just executed very well, whereas Clone Wars can be a little bit confusing because if you noticed on my Google Doc, the Clone Wars episodes did not air in order, which is so confusing. I can't even imagine if I had tried to watch that live. I think I would have just been so lost. But StarWars.com has released the order that you should watch them in if you want the story to make sense. So that's the order that Andrew and I watched them in when we watched Clone Wars. And while it definitely helped the series make more sense, and there were some standout characters on the Clone Wars, like Ahsoka and Ventress are my girls, and I love them so much. But Clone Wars didn't have the same impact on me as Star Wars Rebels did. Star Wars Rebels was like everything. I was such an addict. Andrew and I also have not yet yet watched Resistance, but I know that that one is way more heavily geared toward kids. So while I do think that we will probably give it a chance, most likely finish the season, I'm not expecting to love it like I love Star Wars Rebels. And then we also have the upcoming Mandalorian show, which is going to be on the new Disney streaming service, and that is live action. So that I'm like super looking forward to. Moving on to books. This is the largest category that I want to have completed before Star Wars Episode 9 comes out in December, and I'm pretty confident that I'm going to be able to do it. We'll see. It's an undertaking, but it can happen. So the first book that is in canon at the moment of filming this video is Master and Apprentice, which I mentioned before, and that is the story of Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan. And that is like the official first thing in Star Wars canon, the first thing of anything. It's before any of the movies, it's before any of the comics. It is number one. So if you are just starting out now and you want to start from the beginning, this would be the book where you would start your adventure. Next, as I said before, would be Queen Shadow, which is a story all about Padme, and this one takes place after Attack of the Clones, which is the second prequel film. Since the time of recording, there has been another exciting addition to the Star Wars universe, and that is the canon audiobook written by Kevin Scott and narrated by a full cast. This takes place after Master and Apprentice. It follows a very young Count Dooku, and we see all of his journey from when he is a child, being trained by the Jedi Order, through the time when he chooses to leave the Jedi Order. And I have not listened to it just yet, but we do have Ventress on the cover as well, so you can bet I will be listening to it very soon, but she will likely make an appearance in the story. And like I said, Star Wars canon is constantly changing, so this is another just exciting piece of the puzzle. I do hope that they will traditionally publish this at some point as a hardcover book, because I would love to have it for my collection. But it's very cool that they're experimenting with different ways to add to the Star Wars story. Then right after the Clone Wars, we have Catalyst by James Luceno, and this is a Rogue One story. Then we have one of my personal favorites, which is Dark Disciple by Christy Golden, and this book follows Asajj Ventress and Quinlan Vos. They go on an adventure to try to assassinate Count Dooku, and it is so good. And this is actually the last book right before the final prequel movie, Revenge of the Sith. Oh, I should have said before, Queen's Shadow is actually a young adult book. I will point out when books are young adult. So the next book is also young adult, and that is Ahsoka by E.K. Johnston. This one takes place after Revenge of the Sith, and it fills us in on what Ahsoka has been up to after the Clone Wars. Then we have two more adult novels. So we have Lords of the Sith by Paul S. Kemp, and this is a Darth Vader story, as well as Tarkin, which follows Tarkin by James Luceno. Then we've got Rebel Rising by Beth Revis, and this one follows Jyn Erso, as we know from Rogue One. And Rebel Rising is also a young adult book. Then we've got Thrawn and Thrawn Alliances by Timothy H. Zahn. So Thrawn follows the character Thrawn, who is one of the Chiss from the Outer Regions, and he works his way up in the galactic military, and he becomes an admiral or Grand Admiral, and he's awesome. He's like one of my favorite characters. The first Thrawn book I loved so much. Then we have the second Thrawn book, where we also get a perspective from Darth Vader. That one is interesting because it kind of concurrently takes place within Star Wars Rebels. So even though it's listed as canon prior to Star Wars Rebels, they do reference some of the things that happened within the Rebels television series. Then we've got A New Dawn, and that book follows Hera and Kanan, who are from Star Wars Rebels, and it tells the story of how they met and teamed up. So that one obviously definitely takes place before Rebels. Then we have Most Wanted by Ray Carson, and this is another young adult novel. This book is all about Han and Kira, and it takes place prior to the Solo films. Then we've got Last Shot by Danielle Jose Older, and this is another one that takes place prior to the Solo film, and this follows Han and Lando, and it's like a fun kind of buddy cop story. Then we have Solo the film and Solo the novelization of the film, which is kind of expanded and has some extra scenes that you don't see in the movie. Then we've got Thrawn Treason by Timothy Zahn, and this one I believe is going to take place after Star Wars Rebels. Will hopefully fill in some questions, but this book has not yet been released. This one actually comes out on my birthday, July 23rd of this year, so I know for sure that I'm getting that book on my birthday and definitely starting to read it. Then after Star Wars Rebels, the television show, we have Leia, Princess of Alderaan by Claudia Gray. This is one of my favorite books within the Star Wars universe. I really, really love this one. It follows Leia as a young adult. She's just starting to go on some solo missions within the Senate, and she's really getting a feel for what's going on and discovering the rebellion and finding out what her parents Bail and Breha are involved in. It's so good. It's so good to see young Leia. I love it to pieces. Then we have Rogue One and the novelization of Rogue One. Then we have A New Hope, which is the film, obviously, and then we have From a Certain Point of View. And this was the most unique Star Wars book that's currently in canon because it's not a cohesive story. It's actually an anthology. Each short story is told by a different author and follows a different character. It's from a different perspective. It's really fun to listen to on audio. Andrew and I did that on a road trip. Then we've got Battlefront 2 Inferno Squad by Kirsty Golden. This one I really don't know anything about. I haven't read it yet and I haven't played any of the video games, but I have a feeling that it ties kind of into those, as well as Battlefront Twilight Company by Alexander Freed. Then we have Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, followed by Lost Stars by Claudia Gray. And this is another unique Star Wars novel. This is also a young adult novel, but it follows two characters who you don't see in any of the films. It's a very self-contained story, and while this is where it fits into canon, it doesn't really intersect with the larger, like, overarching story. Then we have the Aftermath trilogy by Chuck Wendig. These are 3 books that take place right after the original trilogy of films, and they fill in all of the things that happened between then and Bloodline by Claudia Gray, which is not the next book. The next book is actually Alphabet Squadron, and this one has not yet been released. It's being released later in 2019, and it's going to follow some of the pilots, but I'm not too familiar with this one, and again, hasn't been released, so I don't know too much about it aside from where it fits into canon. Then we've got Bloodline by Claudia Gray, and this is another one of my favorite books within the Star Wars universe. This follows an adult Leia, and it's one of the last books right before The Force Awakens when the new trilogy started, so you really get into Leia's mind and find out where this new resistance is coming from and the issues that they're facing in the world at the moment, and it really leads you into The Force Awakens quite nicely. Then we've got Phasma by Delilah S. Dawson. This is one that I have not yet read, but it is one that is like next on my list because Phasma is such an interesting character, but she just gets shafted like time and time again. I feel like there was so much buildup for her in Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, and then they just really like didn't deliver at all. So I'm really looking forward to getting her own story, and I've heard wonderful things from people who have read it. So I have a feeling that this will be one of my favorite Star Wars canon novels, but I can't say it with certainty at the time of filming. Then we have A Crash of Fate by Zoraida Cordova. This is a new one that is coming out later this year, and it is a tie-in with Galaxy's Edge, which is the new theme park that's being released at Disney. So they've created this whole new story to go along with Galaxy's Edge and Black Spire, which is like the outpost. We don't know too much about it yet, but these books will hopefully fill that in for us, and then that way once we go to visit Disney we'll know like all the things. And Zoraida Cordova's book is also a young adult book. And then we've got Galaxy's Edge Black Spire by Delilah S. Dawson, who's the author of Phasma as well, and this is another one that should fill in what's going on at Galaxy's Edge for us. All I know is that Hondo better be in it because he's an awesome space pirate and he's for sure in the attraction at Disney. Then we've got The Force Awakens and The Force Awakens novelization. Then we've got Canto Bight, which again is an anthology of stories that takes place in the casino city of Canto Bight, which we see in The Last Jedi. So this is a precursor to The Last Jedi. Then we have The Last Jedi and The Last Jedi novelization, and then we don't have any more books because we are just waiting for episode 9 to happen. But chances are, once that final film does come out in December, the people at Disney and Del Rey, who are the publishers for the Star Wars novels, Disney publishes the young adult books and Del Rey publishes the adult books. They will no doubt be announcing new books that'll take place within Star Wars canon that will either fill in some things that happen between The Last Jedi and episode 9, which we still don't have a title for, or things that might happen after episode 9. So anything can happen. Then lastly, before I wrap up this very long Star Wars video, the only only thing that I want to say is there are comics that are also in the series, which you can also see in the list where they fall into everything. I have not read the majority of the comics, but I have read a good amount of them. And overall, I don't think that they add too much to the universe. There's been the exceptional story here and there, like Darth Maul, Son of Dathomir. That was like my favorite comic collection that I've read thus far. The Thrawn comics I enjoyed, but it was just an adaptation of the first Thrawn novel, so I really didn't need to read it. I went into it expecting something new, some new Thrawn adventure, and the whole thing I was like, I already know this. And then I also really enjoyed Storms of Crate, which is just a one-shot, and that follows Leia, Han, and Luke, and they go to Crate in the time of the original trilogy to see if Crate could be a potential base of operations for the Rebels. It was just a fun story, but it wasn't something like earth-shattering that needed to be told, in my opinion. And I have zero opinion on the video games because I have not played any Star Wars video games, although I do think that Battlefront is gorgeous because I have seen a lot of footage of that from online, but I'm completely unaware of the story involved in that video game, so I can't comment on it. But I really hope that this was helpful. Like I said, I have those Google Docs that I use. I am going to see if I can create a separate version that I can post for anybody to save their own copy of. But yeah, that's how I keep track of what I'm reading in Star Wars canon. I hope that also told you a good place to start, but also just keep in mind that you can kind of start wherever you want as long as you've seen all of the films and watched the television shows. You just have to get your mind into like, okay, this is when this story takes place. Like, put yourself in the frame of the story, because I know I personally had been trying to read a lot of the earlier stuff, so I had been like going through a lot of the prequel stuff, watching a lot of the television series which take place before the films, and then I randomly read Bloodline and I kept having to like readjust my mind and be like, this takes place like so far after everything else that my mind is currently involved in. So you just have to reframe your reality within the universe. Again, I really hope that this was helpful. I'm sorry that I just rambled on forever about Star Wars, but it was really fun for me. And I love these books so much. I love this world so much. I love these characters. They mean so much to me. Like, I can't even put into words how much I admire them and like what a connection I have with so many of the characters in this franchise. I just love them all to pieces. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope that it was helpful, and that's all that I have for this video, so I will see you soon in a new one. Bye!